We are ancient, man. We are going back to diaries and we're writing in diaries. That agenda item that we never used to go to. Part of the administrative and financial issues.
You ready, huh?
Should have warned us that the microphone is open.
Good afternoon. I hear my echo. Is there a way of... There's nothing you can do? Oh, okay.
On your laptop.
Yeah, is the sound on the...
Just turn the sound off on the laptop.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Meena Raman from the Third World Network. For those of you who don't know us, we are headquartered in Malaysia, and we are a network of people around the Third World, and we report on the negotiations, and we take an active part in the climate change talks, but we are also present in many other multilateral spaces. We are really very happy to have this space. No problem, no problem. You want to make sure that Richard's name is, yeah, okay. So we have a very, very exciting panel here, and usually it is the, we want to give the opportunity to the voice of developing countries at this space. And all of them have very busy schedules, so we are very honored that they are able to be with us. And so without further ado, I will take them one by one in terms of introducing you. We do have Mr. Zahir Fakir from South Africa, who is the G77 and China Coordinator for Finance. And he will kick off this session. And then we will, depending on whether Diego comes first or Richa, either of them from Bolivia, Diego will speak for the like-minded developing countries. Richa, who is also India, which is also in the like-minded, will speak after that, because the incoming COP presidency from Egypt has said that he would like to go last. So yeah, we will respect his request. So, Diego, I hope you don't mind. I've asked Zahir to kick off. Yeah? Let him settle down. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Diego, for coming as well from all the running around. So, what we are doing here is our developing country views on the road to COP27. And I will not take more time, and we will entertain some questions at the end, unless some of the speakers have to leave before that. Okay, without further ado, over to you, Zahir. He had a fortune cookie, apparently, which said that he is supposed to be diplomatic, but we have told him, be yourself, Zahir, because this is a very interesting group of people, and we are being live streamed around the world, and this is one of the few panels where you actually have the voice of developing countries. Over to you, Zahir.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Fine. Thank you very much. I'm Zahir Fakir from South Africa. I'm also part of the African group of negotiators, and I'm also the coordinator for the finance for the G77 and China. And it is quite correct. Last night I bought some Chinese takeout and I got a fortune cookie. And the fortune cookie tells me that tomorrow you should be extremely diplomatic in your end. words, and Mina says I shouldn't, but Mina, karma is a very dangerous thing to play with. So I think maybe just to give you a context of where you come from in the finance agenda, people kind of got very absorbed around the 100 billion. And the 100 billion kind of morphed into being this mythical figure of finance and that. But the reality for those who've been following the process and that should know that the real obligation on finance is captured in the convention in Article 4. And it is not 100 billion. The 100 billion comes from a outcome that came out of Copenhagen, where there was this commitment being made that we will provide some fast start finance and we will provide some 100 billion by 2020. What one should also understand, which many people don't recognize, is the evolution of the terminologies that are often being used. In the convention, one always talked about providing finance. And if you look at the Copenhagen, there was a very subtle change that happened there. The Fast Start talks about providing, and the 100 billion talks about mobilization. And for those who are not involved in the negotiations, you would say, but what's the big deal? Mobilizing and providing doesn't make a big difference. It does make a very profound difference. An example would be that in the act of providing is I provide you with some money. The act of mobilization is I provide you with a little bit of money and you use the strength of that money or the leverage of that money to mobilize other money. And that's why you find that when you look at the 100 billion and the OECD report, it talks of climate finance provided and mobilized. And this whole notion of mobilization has gained more and more traction. So what that means is the diminished responsibility on one party to provide and an increased responsibility on the other party to leverage. And you would find this evolution happening in all the funds. If you look at the GEF, when I started working with the GEF, there was this notion that 1-to-1 and I would give you $1 and you provide $1 co-financing. Today the ratios are 7-to-1. That means I, as a developing country, must provide $7 in cash and in kind to get the $1 from the GEF and an additional $5 in investment. You go to the GCF, you'll hear many board members saying, we want to maximize the leveraging of it. So just bear that in mind. What happened in Glasgow? In Glasgow, and I'm a little concerned that people are not more upset from Glasgow and not more angry. Because what Glasgow was a blatant, open statement saying we failed. We failed to provide the 100 billion by 2020. And nobody was really, we note with concern and things like that. And what was even worse was saying, well, we don't really know if we'll make it, but maybe we'll make it in 2024 and that. And it's within that kind of context of failure and that that we are now embarking on a discussion about a new collective quantified goal, or a new acronym that's doing the rounds now, the NCQG. When you talk of the new collective goal, it comes from a certain history. So it's important to understand the history. It's important to understand the lessons from the 100 billion. And what are some of those lessons? And people think sometimes we raise these issues in abstract. So there's a discussion going about the definition of climate finance. And people say, well, why do you bother so much about the definition of that? But the definition issue is one of those issues that is critical for the 100 billion. Because if you do not have a common definition, then one person would say we mobilized and we provided and mobilized 80 billion. Somebody else will say, no, you only did 30 because you don't have a common definition. We don't have a common accounting methodology around us. And we never had any form of reporting, monitoring, or anything. So you have a convention that sets out a goal, and this convention does not have any means by which it can monitor, report, or act on whether you're achieving this or not. You see, that's karma calling me, saying, be diplomatic.
Oh, no.
Be more rude. So, what is the terminologies you hear today? We talk about ambition, we're at the tripping point, we're at the urgency of action and that. how does that marry with what we find in terms of what is being presented to us? And at the workshop that I hosted in Cape Town for the co-chairs, tried to make the point of if we're starting to talk about ambition on a new goal, it talks about being based on the needs of developing countries. And for those who know where the 100 billion comes from, the 100 billion was never based on any needs of any countries. It was based on a collective group of individuals who sat around in a room and thought 100 billion is a very sexy figure, let's do 100 billion. That's how it came about. Nobody looked at it and said, what are the needs? What do we need in terms of achieving the goals of the convention? Or today, what is it that we need to do the 1.5 or achieve the adaptation? It was based on a figure that. Today, if you look at the needs, and last year, for the first time, after almost 20 some odd years, we have managed to effect one thing in the convention, which was the actual needs determination, where the convention asked us to actually determine what is the needs of developing countries. And this was information that was supposed to guide the processes that we have in determining these goals, in determining replenishments of conventions and that. Can you imagine? It took us 20 years of fighting, and even Benedicta's rest her soul always fought about it, never lived to see that happening. And what did that report tell us? When we looked at an assessment of all the reports that were out there, national communications, the NDCs, and everything else, one thing we found is that of all the reports, on average, only 30% of all the needs have been costed by developing countries. So that's a challenge on us developing countries to actually start looking at doing better work in costing. But even from that 30%, it found that the actual needs, and these were needs in terms of addressing the objectives of the convention and meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, range between 5 to 11 trillion. That is 30% of it. So if you're going into the additional 70%, takes you in a different figure altogether. So if your needs are between 5 and 11 trillion, 100 billion represents something like 0.9 to 2% of what your needs are. But we say very boldly in the statements that the goal should be based on the needs of developing countries. And starting from a floor of 100 billion, yeah, it's great for the language. But does this really start talking about the ambition that you are talking about? Does this really talk about the sense of urgency? Let alone all the other complicated things that come with the negotiations. In terms of the work around the new collective goal, what we need to be looking at is collectively identifying what could be a realistic, ambitious goal. And not just merely a doubling of the doubling, as you hear often people talk about, or just coming up with some. We really need to do, and you need to ask the question, why we're doing it. It's not just because there's some decision out there. There's something much more behind that in terms of that. So if you are looking at a realistic goal, then the question that begs is, what is that realistic goal? And there's various methodologies that come out there that one can look at approaching it. One methodology is taking this principle from the convention that says, well, what developed countries are supposed to provide is incremental cost financing. And the incremental cost financing to support, there's two things: full cost financing to support convention commitments, which are your reporting commitments, and even there they don't provide full cost. But in terms of actions, it's based on this idea that we will provide incremental cost, and it's based on this notion about, well, we're providing the financing for global benefits. So if you follow that kind of approach, and if you follow the approach that developed countries impose on developing countries, like in the GEF or the others, the GEF is saying 7 to 1, the GCF says 4 to 1. If you're using those kind of ratios and saying, well, if you are supposed to be providing us the 1 and we need to leverage the 4 or that, then if you're using a base of 5 trillion, your goal should be in the range of 1 trillion, allowing you to be able to leverage the 5 and get to that range. But when it comes to the issue of providing financing, nobody wants to talk about these kind of things in that manner. But when it comes to us accessing financing, we're always saying, well, we need to maximize the dollar, we need to leverage and that. So when we start looking at the goal, the role that we are playing in terms of that is getting people onto the same trajectory to look at something ambitious. Unfortunately, what's happening in the discussion now, nobody's talking about what an ambitious quantified goal would be, and everybody's talking about everything else. Collective, what does it mean? Does it mean everybody has to pay? We're talking about things from fossil fuel subsidies to carbon taxes. We're talking about how the private sector's role in the goal and things like that, which are interesting discussions, but does not go to the heart of what we are supposed to be doing. What we're supposed to be doing is by 2025 to take a decision on what a new collective quantified goal would be, and one that is ambitious and commensurate with the ambition that we're saying that we need in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Thanks very much.
That was very quick. Zahir, you could have taken more time, but I'm sure there will be questions from the floor. So thank you very much for taking us through that history. I think that many people don't actually know the context, so thank you for providing that. The next person who will take the floor is our dear friend and colleague from Bolivia, Mr. Diego Pacheco, and he is representing the like-minded developing countries, and is the father of the Article 6.8 mechanism. I heard you got an applause or something in the room for framing that, making that presentation. So over to you, Diego.
Thank you very much, Mina. Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. Well, it is always very nice to share reflections in this scenario, and to assess to some extent what is the process of negotiations, what are the main challenges, well, in particular for developing countries. And I really appreciate, Mina, and all the work of the TWN. You really have the bringing on the table always the issues and the interests of developing countries in this very, very complex setting. Well, I was in the process of negotiation towards the Paris Agreement almost 5 years. I spent there, and I came back the last year in 2021 in the context of the discussions for the COP26 in Glasgow. And I found there that, well, the process really has evolved, of course, so there was a lot of work in the last years. However, all the delicate balance that we tried to achieve in the Paris Agreement was in danger. It's still in danger because, well, towards the Paris Agreement, we had a very long discussions and negotiation process in order to really keep all the elements of climate change on the table and to have an agreement to really address the different elements and in a very comprehensive and articulated way. So finally, we have an agreement addressing issues of mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and means of implementation in the different articles. And at the end, we saw that we had something that should really move forward, a very integrated and comprehensive solution for addressing the climate crisis in the world. However, we found a very complex narrative of in order to address the climate change towards the COP 2026. And this narrative clearly articulated very cleverly two issues. The first, the idea of the net zero by 2050, and the issue of urgency to achieve, to keep the 1.5 degrees objective within reach. So these two issues were very well articulated in a narrative that finally appears in the Glasgow Colonial Pact, the Glasgow Climate Pact, and the narrative is there. No, they put the net zero by 2050 is not clearly stated. It's not explicit in the sense that if it is for all parties by 2050. But I think that if you discuss with a developed country a negotiator, of course they will see clearly that they put the achievement of the goal of net zero by 2050 for all countries. It's not a global goal. It's for each of the countries of the world to the need to achieve the net zero by 2050. Of course, if I read the article, I can say no. It is still in the reading the idea that it's a global net zero by 2050. So there is a kind of an ambiguity there. Well, this ambiguity, is very well articulated to the issue of the 1.5 degrees. And of course, all developing countries, we are very close to the idea that we should limit the temperature goal to the 1.5. Otherwise, we are putting a serious risk to the planet, to the Mother Earth, if we follow a trend to move beyond the 1.5, so this is very close to our hearts, the 1.5, and therefore we should support, obviously, the issue of the 1.5 degrees. In the particular case of Bolivia, we fully support the 1.5 urgency, but we are not able to support, and the LMDC is not able to support the objective to achieve the net zero by 2050 for all countries. These are the basis of what we are calling the carbon colonialism, the Glasgow Colonial Pact. Because, it is really moving the Paris Agreement to in a way where the developed countries have the flexibility to achieve the goal by 2050, but are really shifting all the burden of the climate change to the developing world, to the developing countries. And in the process, they are creating a kind of financial and institutional structures to really trap the developed countries in more dependency towards this ruling of the global north, the new ruling of the global north. So developing countries will really act as a sinks of carbon emissions, and the developed world will have enough flexibility to achieve in a very, very comfortable way the goal by 2050, because they really have the financial conditions and the technical capabilities to achieve that goal. They are not putting any pressure to achieve this goal of the 2050. So I think that's the one, the great imbalance that is creating the Glasgow Pact. And we are dealing now in this process, in this SB session with that imbalance. And that was the fight of yesterday, of the agenda fight, trying to include, to make more visibility to the adaptation goal. Because in the Paris Agreement, we have had that was the agreement, really, to have the mitigation goal and to have the global goal on adaptation. But we put a lot of effort, 5 years finishing the procedures and methodologies for enhancing mitigation, but we forgot completely the issue of adaptation and the global goal on adaptation. It is complex. We know that framing and shaping a global goal of adaptation is not an easy task. But because it is not easy, we should have put more efforts in order to really address the issues of adaptation, methodologies, procedures, and to have more clarity in the scope of the global goal on adaptation. But we don't have. We are still starting, we are initiating the discussion of the global goal on adaptation and all the related issues, finance for adaptation, means of implementation for adaptation. That's the fight. We have created in Glasgow, we push, well, developed countries push very hard with support of some developing countries on a very unbalanced process. And we need to now and that's the idea, and that should be the goal of the COP27, to achieve the new balance. No, we do really need to achieve a new balance in this negotiation process. Otherwise, well, we are following a very risky process in which, well, developed countries will already dilute all their responsibilities, and they are living alone. They are living alone to the developing world. And that's not possible because, well, if that happens, well, as I said, we are going to go trapped again in a new dependency from the global south to the global north. So that's one of the key issues in the negotiation process for the like-minded developing countries. If you are going to keep this idea of the net zero by 2050, developed countries should do more and earlier. They should do at least by 2030 real reductions of emissions in order to preserve this balance and to preserve the principles of the Convention and of the Paris Agreement. So the operationalization of equity goes in that direction. So if we are going to operationalize equity in this frame of mitigation, that implies that developed countries should really move forward objectives by 2030 and leaving a carbon space for the developing world and not consuming the carbon space of the developing world. That's the idea that implies for the developing countries to have a more specific proposals regarding adaptation, regarding how we are going to frame and to articulate all issues in the context of the discussion of the global goal on adaptation. We need to really have a specific proposal, a specific decision for moving forward very strongly this issue on the COP27. So if the COP27 is the COP on implementation, is really the COP on adaptation. And therefore, we need to really work very hard in order to have a clarity and a very straightforward proposal for the GGA for discussion in the COP27. And there are additional challenges, because if we do really want to work in a new balance, we also need to keep the G77 in a very united in the issue of adaptation. Yesterday was a kind of well, we showed that the G77 is still a very relevant actor in the UNFCCC negotiations, and we need to really preserve the strong voice of the G77 in the issue of adaptation and finance. Otherwise, it will be very, very difficult to really achieve a financial commitment in the COP27. So if we do not really have a solid and strong G77 voice also in the issue of finance not only for adaptation but also for loss and damage. And of course, well, there are other issues that are very important for the LMDC towards the COP27 beyond mitigation and adaptation. Well, is the issue of the loss and damage, but we are still discussing how to provide more clarity. Well, the clarity is there. We need to really try to educate our partners in several issues, in particular related to the Article 6.8. It's very important also to move forward in a very balanced way the market and the non-market approaches. The issue of agriculture is also very important towards the COP27. We want to see reflected there that there is a different indigenous peoples and local community systems, traditional systems of agriculture, which are not the same to the agro-industry model. So we need to really differentiate how we are going to address issues of agriculture in the developing world with regard to the developed world. And well, other issues that we have been working always in the LMDC, such as the response measures, we need also to address issue related to the improving the tools and methodologies to evaluate the impacts of the response measures. So that's I want to share with you, friends. I think that there is still an important fight to face, and I think at least for the LMDC, we see that the parties that we are in this group, we are very united, and we have a very clear common position, and we are going to address all these issues in the negotiation process now and in the COP27. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diego. Now we come to Richa Sharma. I don't want to be provocative, but you're free to say what you want. But coming out of Glasgow and all the media portrayal of that famous paragraph on the unabated coal and the inefficient fossil fuels, and when India and China added, needing to target to ensure that you don't cause trouble for the poor. I mean, that was picked up as a big problem for the rest of the world, as if you were standing against ambition in the climate space, and when you were standing for climate justice. So I'm sure you have a lot to say, Risha. And I think the civil society, a lot of us are in this group here, I can see, and also there are others who are here. They took a long time to actually recognize the fact that if you just look at why did they pick coal, why didn't they pick all the other fossil fuels? Because they are not relying on those fossil fuels. They're moving away from coal and they're going into oil and gas. And after the Ukraine crisis, we see they're not even moving away from all that, and they're expanding. And so that hypocrisy of we have to limit, the temperature rise, and we're going to save the world, and we all call this hypocrisy, and so I'm sure you have a lot to say on this matter. So over to you. And Richa, by the way, is the head of delegation of India.
It's already on. Yeah. Thank you, Meena. So without the benefit of a fortune cookie, I will, I imagine that if I had one, it would ask me to keep my remarks brief and also avoid repetition. So I'll try and do that. I think the theme of this session is the developing countries' perspectives on the roads to COP27. To that, I would say that the COP27 would be held in the backdrop of the full I believe the IPCC synthesis report, the complete report would have come out by the time in time for COP27. And I'm sure that it would, already amplify our collective concerns with regards to the importance of combating climate change, mitigating emissions, but also adapting to its impacts. In our view, the Glasgow Climate Pact is a mitigation-centric pact. And if you read the Glasgow Climate Pact, you would find several elements which are absolutely mitigation-centric. Just a couple of examples. The mitigation part of the pact establishes a mitigation work program with a very targeted timeline. It calls for annual ministerial roundtables on mitigation ambition. It asks for an annual NDC synthesis report, and by no means is that unimportant. It is absolutely important, and we are glad that it is there. It also invites parties, whereas the Paris Agreement, provides for a cycle of ambition enhancement in view of the, rapid need to reduce emissions to keep the temperature target within reach. It also asks parties to, submit their long-term strategies and also update those strategies. It asks for parties to consider NDC enhancement perhaps on an annual basis if they can. So there are many elements which are absolutely mitigation-centric. So our hope is that the COP27 would restore the balance with regards to adaptation and loss and damage. I'd like to draw your attention to how the opening plenaries of the subsidiary bodies have unfolded. You have seen for yourself that despite there being a clear mandate in the Glasgow Climate Pact for a global, for immediately starting a work program, on the global goal for adaptation, that issue did not even figure in the provisional agenda that was circulated by the, for the meeting of the subsidiary bodies. It was a fight led by LMDC and Bolivia to even get that agenda included. Once that agenda was included, there was a discussion on how much time can be allocated to discuss that agenda. Now, the issues of adaptation, loss, and damage are critical to the developing countries, and we hope that the COP27 would restore the balance in favor of, balance means equal importance to adaptation and mitigation, but for developing countries where, historically their contribution to the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere has been less, significantly less, if I may say so, where per capita emissions still remain low, significantly low, if I may add again, in those countries which are suffering the impacts of climate change disproportionately. And I say disproportionately in the sense that it is true that the impacts of climate change impact everybody, whether in the developed countries or the developing countries. And we have seen that happen, for example, in Canada, in Germany, in the United States, and of course in the developing countries. The question is of, capacity, resilience and adaptive capacity. In countries that already, have high levels of per capita GDP, they have, for that reason, better abilities to adapt to climate change and build the resilience of their populations. So we sometimes feel that really rapid development is truly the best response to climate change. And it means a rapid development, which is also a green development, which is a sustainable development. But it is a high level of per capita incomes, high levels of GDP, which allow countries to build resilience of their populations against climate change. So our next expectation is for the COP27 to, rapidly accelerate the delivery of enablers of climate action to the developing countries. And one cannot add anything to what Zahir has said with regards to climate finance. Obviously, we would say that climate finance remains critical, and it remains critical for adaptation as well as for mitigation. So enablers of climate action is important. The loss and damage issue, I would repeat that the impacts are disproportionate on vulnerable countries, on small island developing states. India also has a 7,500 long coastline, several islands in the Andaman and Nicobar and Lakshadweep. Therefore, we absolutely understand what it means for our colleagues in the small island developing states to say that they face an existential crisis. So we are very much with them in the need for accelerated mitigation alongside accelerated adaptation and the responsibility, and in calling upon the responsibility of the developed countries to provide the means of implementation support for the whole world to, accelerate climate action. I think my one other point was also with regard to, the whole discourse with regard to who needs to do more, who needs to go first, who needs to go last. And all this when we are actually facing a climate crisis. The reality, and this is a scientific fact established by the, in the reports of the IPCC working groups 2 and 3, in which the historical accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the contribution of certain countries to it disproportionately has been established. It follows, therefore, that those that have already proceeded considerably on a path of, those that have made significant development gains should also be in a position to take stronger mitigation action. So we do hope that in the for the COP27, we are able to come together with certain elements of a mitigation work program that provides confidence to the world that collectively as parties, we are on track to deliver mitigation, deliver on our mitigation goals as well. I think I'll close my remarks there and happy to respond to any issues that might arise later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richa. So we have a lot of expectations for COP27, Mo. So this brings me to Ambassador Mo Nasser from Egypt, who wanted to go last. I'm sure he's inspired by the panel members. And how are you going to deliver on all their expectations?
Thank you so much, Mina. Now I should have gone first. I mean, after this, I shouldn't have taken the decision of being the last speaker. But it also, like, it provided a lot, and it is important that coming from now sitting as a presidency seat to also share with the CSOs and NGOs and all the partners in this process where things are, because as was mentioned, this process has evolved a lot. Very quickly, I've been in this process not as long as others here in the table, but I've been here since 2008, and we have witnessed together moving forward on this process, how the process has evolved. As presidency now, then I'm looking at if I can say it, the bigger picture, which goes beyond the negotiations to include the other informal process. And it is this informal process has mushroomed very much, especially in Glasgow. For those of you who are in Glasgow, they could have went to the Blue Zone and see the ratio between the number of participants in the negotiating rooms and the number of participants in the rest of the Blue Zone and pavilions, as we call it, and the activities happening in the pavilions versus the negotiations happening in the rest of the process. So the process in itself has evolved, yes. I would say it has changed, and this is the most challenging part, not only in the participation or in the mood of participation, but also that the intergovernmental process, although it is the core and it will stay the core, and it is the process that sets the rules, but again, the other informal process, be it from the private sector, other stakeholders, initiatives, and so on and so forth, is now playing a role in formulating the outcomes. So many of you have heard about the methane pledge, and the methane pledge was not in the formal process. This came out of the informal process. Many have heard about the other initiatives coming from ICAO or other sectors. Those were not in the formal process, although they were discussed in a way or another in the formal process. So all the challenges that you have heard from the distinguished speakers, which relates very much to the formal process, are yet but part of the challenge that we have. As presidency, you have to deal with this wide spectrum of stakeholders, be them the parties or the NGOs, but also the international organizations, the international institutions, the private sector, which is now coming very strong, the new technologies, investors, and so on and so forth. And you need to have like a balanced approach across the board. So this is my first point. My second point is that we as Egypt, and having been part of this process for so long and member of the African group and the LMDC and the wider G77 and the Arab group and Mediterranean, we're members of too many organizations, coalitions, and groupings. We were very much aware that having one-sided outcome will be problematic in this process, because we are sensitive to what and we are part of what was mentioned now on having this holistic approach to climate change. You need to include the social and economic dimensions. You need to include poverty eradication when it comes to developing countries. You need to take into consideration the different starting points. You need to follow the agreed principles. And here we were very clear that our reference has always been the convention, which is principles, and the Paris Agreement, which is in its balance between the different elements, be it loss and damage, adaptation, finance, technology, transparency. And if we deviate from those very delicate balances, then we will, I mean, the legacy of the outcome will be in question, like what we heard now on previous or the last COP. But also we need to say that what science is telling us is that we need to move as quickly and at scale, and this is something that nobody can challenge. But from our point of view, that we need to achieve that following the rules and the agreements that we have. So if the rule says those countries are taking the lead and they, because of their capacities and because of several elements, the responsibilities and so on, then they should fulfill that. Second point from our point of view is that we have been doing this planning processes for very long time in the process. We did the NAPAs, we did the NAPs, we did the NDCs, we did the low emission development strategies, we did everything. But now it is time, because science is telling us that we are really running out of time, it is time to really focus on implementation and have a clear assessment where we are. And let's see what is happening on the ground. Is there the possibility of replicability of success stories, scalability of success stories between developing countries, between developed and developing? It goes both ways, but with a very strong focus on those who are really in need, which are developing countries, because they are the ones who are, I wouldn't say not only they are the ones who are hit hard, but also they are the ones who might, or most probably, lack the capacity to deal with the impacts. Although many of them have the potentials, and they might lack the capacity to utilize the potentials that they have, because many things that were just mentioned, either by Zahir in relation to finance or by Rish and Diego when it comes to adaptation. And I'm sure, like you have, all of you are aware of the difficulties developing countries are facing when it comes to implementing the plans that they are being asked to enhance and move forward. So coming from that, from the COP President vision in this intergovernmental process, his definition of success was very clear, that it has to be balanced, substantial and substantive outcomes in all elements under negotiations, following the agreed balance that we have achieved in Paris, with priorities, of course, to what science is telling us. And by the way, science is telling us both in adaptation and in mitigation. So it is not only what we are being called to take action on mitigation, but also the working group of on adaptation in the IPCC is telling us that we are falling far behind when it comes to adaptation actions and building resilience. Also, that we need to deal with the urgent needs now, be it on the loss and damage side, which is a very important element to all, but also on the adaptation and building resilience side. So it is not either or, but it is the inclusive approach that deals with everything. And it is the holistic approach that takes into consideration the dimension of of human beings and the social dimension, and the economic development and poverty eradication. So those are the outlines of what the presidency, the COP president, has highlighted moving forward on that. So that was my first part, if I would say. The second part is when we looked at what do we have as expected outcomes from Sharm el-Sheikh, we faced the dilemma that although there are several mandates that are there, but what developing countries have asked for, especially on the GGA and loss and damage dialogue and the new collective goal, those were created as processes that goes beyond Sharm el-Sheikh. So GGA ends in Abu Dhabi or in Emirates, and the next year the finance goal goes like for another 2 years, loss and damage for another year or two. So there was, and there is a push from some parties saying that, well, we shouldn't be doing anything in Sharm. Let's wait until the end of this process and then evaluate what comes out. As presidency, we say we have a responsibility not only in front of our people and our constituency, but in front of the whole world, that no, this is not the process that we envisage, and we will not be working on this basis. What we envisage is that all the creative processes have to have a stock taking, or the ones that finishes, of course, in Sharm will finish. Other ones, they need to have a stock taking, clear stock taking on the substance of the discussion and the progress achieved during this year. Because we as parties, we can sit together and say, well guys, we under the GGA, maybe the discussions were not going with the right pace or the right content, and this will not take us in the next year to have an agreed outcome that is up to the expectation of the parties who have accepted, as was mentioned, a very mitigation-centric outcome in Glasgow, but it had a promise for mitigation is in Sharm el-Sheikh, and then it has promise on the adaptation, loss and damage, and finance to be coming after that. So unless we sit together and assess how much progress in substance and content and have happened on those elements, then we are not really like up to the expectation of the world. It's not only our people, but it is the global expectation. Second, that this year we also face several challenges, but on top of them, what science is telling us. I don't know if the AR6 will be out or not, but at least we have working group 2 and 3, which are telling us that we are not on track on anything. This is one. Then we are having an oceans conference on the UN Oceans Conference, which most probably will be telling us we need to do more when it comes to oceans. We already have the UNEP and UNI outcomes, which is, again, telling us that in many issues, the international community globally, we are not right on track. And we are having the desertification COP outcome that says that desertification is increasing, all the goals that are not being achieved, land degradation is happening, as was mentioned by Diego and India and other discussions in other fora, and of course South Africa and others. Agriculture is very important simply because we are facing food crisis now, and in particular in Africa. We are facing energy crisis, I mean, in addition to the geopolitical crisis. So within this big context, we are having this COP27. We didn't anticipate it to be that complicated at the beginning, I have to say. As the lead negotiator for Egypt, I mean, it is becoming very difficult and concerning to us because you need to navigate between all of those elements that I mentioned. And for this, part of the intergovernmental official process outcome is the issue of balance in content and substance and progression in the negotiations. This is one. On the other issues, which is the new upgraded part of the informal process, we have identified 17 topics, I wouldn't say initiatives now, but 17 topics of interest that we have observed across the years. Those start with the water, adaptation, just transition, energy, renewable energy, gender, civil society, and others. And all of this will be very soon on the website. Of course, we have identified 10 major thematic days that brings in not only the usual days that we have on finance or energy or adaptation or agriculture, but it goes beyond. So we are bringing in water, we are bringing in decarbonization, we are bringing in solutions, we are bringing in gender, because we believe that a lot is being done outside, but it is not seen by others. So if I have a success story in South Africa, maybe our friends in Morocco, they haven't seen it, and this is the chance where everybody is sitting in the climate change circus, as you call it, among ourselves. Everybody is there, like name who is sitting in the conference there, and this is the time where you can always showcase things for decision makers, for policy makers, for international institutions, for CSOs, for NGOs. So we have the thematic days, we have the 17 topics, and then we have within the 17 topics, we have like a cross-cutting interaction with the civil society and youth. They are part of this whole movement. Again, the definition was, can we issue initiatives that really make sense? And let me share with you that our understanding in Glasgow, there was 85 initiatives. I don't know if anybody can count them. I myself cannot count all of them. But I do remember, of course, the methane pledge one, and among others. When you start working on or hosting a COP, then everybody wants to be part of the COP. Everybody at the national level. So everybody will be coming with ideas, their own vision of what climate change is, their own interpretation of what will be the outcome. So one, yes, we will have several initiatives. So please bear with us. Many of them might end up in the COP, others might continue. Two, our responsibility is that we need to bring initiatives that makes a difference, at least like 3 or 4 main initiatives. And from our point of view, those have to have as I said, the holistic approach. It has to have the social dimension, the economic dimension, and they are, of course, environment and climate focused. And 3, they have to build on whatever is there, and it is not replicating whatever goals or deliverables that have been issued in other conferences or in other fora. Issues of loss and damage, adaptation, water, agriculture are on top of our agenda. Early warning and building capacities, of course, is on top of our agenda. Finance is a cornerstone. We have always identified that. And how can we move on the finance part taken into consideration now with the financial, I wouldn't say crisis, challenge that many countries are facing, in particular in developing countries, not only the delivery of the 100 billion or the needs of the 5 to 6 trillion, but also that many countries, if I take my Africa, for example, 80% of the African countries are not credit-worthy countries, so investments will not flow there. Many countries are highly indebted countries, so the cost of finance to do the same project in a developing country will be like threefold the cost of the same project in a developed country. If we issue green bonds, everybody is promoting green bonds. You issue green bonds, then you get the same market price, but with extra reporting and additional requirements. So those are elements that we thought of when we discuss implementation. We need to highlight those elements and challenges, because it is nice to say nice words and go in the media with flashy headlines and say we are in the 130 trillion are there waiting to be channeled to the projects, and then you go and knock on the door, where is, can I get 100 million? Then you tell, no, you don't qualify on this, or you cannot, you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, up to 30, which things does not match. So our idea, and this is, we keep our fingers crossed, and we hope that through a focus on implementation, we'll be able to bring forward those challenges, and we'll move from the theoretical science-based policy, higher policy related thing into the real practical things on the ground. How can we make things happen? How can we do the transformation? How can we manage the transformation? How can we do it correct and the right way? Of course, this is very wishful thinking. Being in this process for a long time, and but again, this is what we believe in, and this is where we rely on three main things. One, that we need from the parties clear asks, especially from developing countries. I can have a statement that will take 3 days. If I don't have like the 3 clear points or my asks very focused, then all of what I say will be lost. Because simply what we have seen as presidency, that some countries, specifically of course the developed ones, have very clear view on what they want. So they would tell you 1, 2, 3, 4, this is it. And many developing countries, they have all the shopping list. Of course, this is all important for them, but tell me what are your 3 main points. So I can bring them forward, I push them, I fight for them. And this is where the balance will lie on at the end. So the first point is clear asks. Second point is that voices needs to be heard, especially from the NGOs and CSOs. They need, I mean, we had a meeting, the COP president, when we had the ministerial in Copenhagen, climate justice, were having like a big demonstration outside. And we called them in, and they spoke to the COP president. And I wouldn't say for his surprise, but because we have been telling him that, it was 90% of what they were saying was exactly what we believe in. So it is, we are saying the same message. Maybe we're putting different terminologies, maybe with different priorities, but I think what Diego or Risha or Zahir have mentioned, or Mina would mention, and this is what all the CSOs are mentioning. We need to do the transformation. Yes, we need to do it at scale. We need to do it timely. We need to do it based on principles and through justice and through a just transformation, just transition, and for the sake of humanity and for the sake of everybody, not for the sake of some. And it has to take into consideration that we have different starting points and we have different capabilities, and it is about solidarity. It's not about like a group of countries moving forward. And we didn't, I mean, climate change didn't start like last year or in 2015 or in 2020. And there is a historical responsibility there. Put it in whatever way or form, but it is there. It does exist. It do exist. So those are the, I would say, the outlines. What we need from the CSOs and NGOs is have clear message and voice. Criticism is very important. Criticize politicians, countries, whatever, but also you need to put something that is very much based on realities. So we all know what IPCC is saying. Okay? If IPCC is saying we need to stop deforestation now or reduce deforestation by 90% in the next 5 years, reality saying, is it possible? You need to ask yourselves. Of course it is possible. Yes, I hope so. But how? What is the cause for that? How can we do it? So the targets, the science targets are very important, but how you translate them into implementable actions. This is also very important. And we need from the NGOs and CSOs, and many of them are providing that now in the reports, is that how can we manage this transition? How can we achieve that? We need to take into consideration what things are being said, like Zahir told you, like we have the Standing Committee on Finance report, which is a UNFCCC outcome, saying that it is between 5 to 11 trillion. Can anybody of you tell me when was the SCF report captured, or the figure of 5 or 6 trillion was mentioned by anyone? Just think, look at the media. This is where we need you to do. I mean, everybody is focusing on the 100 billion. Okay, that's fine. So 100 billion will take you 0.1 degrees. The 5 trillion will take you to maybe one degree. It will not put you to the 1.5 degree or the below 2 degrees, by the way. But it is the indices that are there, which the IPCC has based all its science that all those indices are going to be implemented. And the IPCC did not consider that there is no financial resources to implement the majority of developing countries' indices. And this was one of the discussions that we had in the 1.5 degree report, that you need to have the two components. Yes, those are very nice plans. Let's implement them. Do we have the resources? Do we have the means? Do we have the, it's not only about the policies, but the resources and the means. I'll stop there because I have, as COP president, I am impartial. I have to be neutral, and I cannot say any positions. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mo. Yeah, very rich points that you have given. I just wanted to say about the mitigation. We have this book here by the Third World Network, which we have produced, and it will show you that this idea of mitigation-centricness was not new. It started ever since the run-up to the Paris Agreement. It was all about mitigation-centric. And there was actually a plan to replace the Kyoto Protocol with a mitigation-centric agreement. And please, for those of you who don't know history, come and see us and we'll give you this, not give you, but we will tell you how you can get this. And this is very important for history. So this mitigation-centric nature is something that we need to, it is an orchestration right from the very beginning. So this fight to maintain the balance is so important. Okay, open the floor for questions. Many of our delegates will have to go, but I'd like to ask you to identify who you are and to whom you're posing this question. Okay, Niti first from Malaysia, followed by colleague over there. We'll take a few questions first.
Sure. Hi, I'm Niti from Climate Action Network, Southeast Asia. I'm from Malaysia. I have a question for Mr. Pacheco and for the ambassador from Egypt. For us observers, could you explain why the GGA didn't come onto the provisional agenda, or why you didn't push for it on the provisional agenda? And were you surprised by the reaction from Switzerland? And to the ambassador from Egypt, what priority are you giving for the creation of a finance facility for loss and damage at COP27? And do you see the fact that loss and damage is not on the agenda here as a setback towards achieving that? Thank you.
Thank you, Niti.
Hello, thank you, speakers. My name's Katie Glogally-Swan, and I'm Economic Affairs Officer at the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, which, as I'm sure some of you know, or maybe all of you know, has its origins also in the founding of the G77, and so continues to have its mandate focused on the development priorities of developing countries. It's been fantastic hearing all of your contributions, and I couldn't agree more with the different interventions. You know, when more than 800 million people still don't have access to energy in the world, you know, the development gap there is staggering. I suppose my question, I have so many questions, but to stay focused on climate finance, because that is the division that I work in UNCTAD's priority area, or at least finance and global economic governance. The realm that we normally work in is less UNFCCC and more IMF, World Bank, multilateral development banks, and we're trying to bridge that gap and build more linkages into the UNFCCC process and into the Paris Agreement process. And Mr. Fakir, you were talking about the sort of new goal. I suppose I have two questions on those linkages to the sort of global economic governance regime. Number one is about the opinions on the panel on sources of financing, you know, beyond of course, this distinction between public and private sector, and Mr. Fakir eloquently talked about the leverage myth, but also about, for example, new allocations of special drawing rights and other new mechanisms that are beginning to come on the agenda. And then second of all, to the ambassador's point about debt and fiscal stability, from our end and from the arena that we work in, that feels like a massive gap in the conversations about, so many countries are being engulfed by debt crisis. It's a chokehold on climate action. So where do you see the role of debt in the conversations this year or in the coming years in moving towards a new quantified goal? Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. The role of debt. So I think we'll take those two questions first, and then we have Diego, and then we have Ambassador Moore, and we have Zahir, in that order. And Richa, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, regarding the question of the agenda item, well, when we reviewed the agenda presented for this SB session, well, the LMDC realized that we had only an item in the agenda for the mandated event on this dialogue on the GGA. And that's why the LMDC suggested the inclusion of the in the agenda item for a specific item for the work program on the GGA. Because in our understanding, well, there was already a mandate to launch immediately the work program, so it was a completely oversight not to include the work program in the agenda. So we requested, in accordance to Article 12, I think, with the rules of procedure, to include this item in the agenda, and also to include the matter related to the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage. So there were two requests for the global GGA and for the loss and damage. This was included in the supplementary agenda, and well, when in the G77 meeting also we had an agreement that the G77 supported both the inclusion of both items in the agenda, but in the second one regarding loss and damage, well, ours is requested not to go into an agenda fight, but ours is supported also to include the loss and damage in the as a G77 common position in the agenda. So with this position of the G77 of supporting the inclusion of both agenda items, well, the chairs of the substance SBI requested to have a meeting of heads of delegation on Monday morning. And we had this meeting of heads of delegation, and the chairs of the SABSTA and SBI suggested to include in the supplementary agenda the GGA. No, well, the G77 was okay, of course, with this proposal because we request to include the GGA. But in the discussions of the heads of delegation, Switzerland said that, this was a kind of a duplication of discussions. So there was no need to really include a work program on the GGA because the discussion had to take place in the workshop. And therefore, this was a discussion, and there was for them no any meaning. It was meaningless to start the work program because, well, there is no clarity in the scope of the work program, so the discussion would have a duplicate at all. And in that context, well, Switzerland suggested to have only one session for the work program. But in order to have an agreement, well, the SABSTA chair said that, well, we should have at least one opening session and one closing session, no? And that was the agreement in the heads of delegation meeting. But in the plenary, when we were discussing this issue, well, the Switzerland again requested the floor, and he said that the agreement was not to have at least 2 sessions, but only 2 sessions, the opening and the closing. No, that was the misunderstanding between the developing countries under the leadership of the chair of the G7 and the understanding of Switzerland regarding the agreement that we had in the heads of delegation meeting, and that was the fight. No, and that was the first time that we did discuss and trying to agree how many sessions that we are going to allocate for the discussion of each of the working groups. No, and that was the fight for the SAPSA and SBI. And finally, because of the a strong position of some parties, in particular the LMDC, the SAPSA and SBI chairs called for another meeting to have a new understanding of how we are going to proceed. And finally, the understanding is that, well, the chairs will, well, we need to trust in the chairs. They will see how many sessions are required for in order to really keep the balance and to move forward both issues in a very balanced way. That was the fight. But finally, it was a fight between to address the importance equally of mitigation and adaptation, trying some parties always to dilute the issues of adaptation and not to really consider properly.
You can read the Third World Network update number 2 for the details. We've already written it and it's available on the website. Who wants to go first, Zahir or Mo?
Yeah, because I will have to leave very soon. Thank you so much for the question. But again, the answer for the how we want to deal with this finance facility lies in the hands of the parties. Specifically what Diego has just mentioned. If parties fight for what they want, then presidency, then we can try to work this out. If parties do not fight for it, then as presidency, I cannot force anything. The issue that presidencies, to a great extent, are kind of, and this is reality, they have a very limited role. The role is to facilitate a lending zone or lending ground, and where issues are not really moving forward. And this, again, will be based on what the countries, the parties ask for and how strong they ask for it. And the manifestation of that was simply yesterday, when we had a very strong push from LMDC saying we want the GGA on the agenda. Then it was on the agenda. And you could see, as Diego has explained, some parties trying to neutralize it being on the agenda. So there are a lot of ways that this process functions. And you need to master the process to know how it functions. Because reality is, most probably the decision in Glasgow didn't say that the GGA would be on this SPI, it would say it would be on the next SPI. But if parties decide otherwise, and it's up to the parties. And this is the thing. That's why we are asking. Please, clear asks, clear 3-4 elements. Very strong messaging on that. So anything that relates to the outcomes, again, if it's not called on from the parties and consistent and strong and clear, then it will be, as presidency, you cannot push, you cannot force things. Because you will get a very simple answer, but nobody asked for it. It was only one party who asked for it. So, and we have seen it before, and we have seen it in the process. I think that was the question for me. I don't know the other ones on debt. Again, within the process, the formal process, you don't have something, and Zahir will elaborate more on that. But we can have it on the initiatives, and this is what we are working on. And this is one of the things that we have identified as topic of interest, which is just investments and financial flows and the new instruments. And again, I served in Geneva for a while, and UNCTAD, I've been working with the investment team in UNCTAD for long, and I know the challenges. And MENA and the TWN and the South Central have been working on that, on the investment agreements and what is in favor and what is not in favor of developing countries. When it comes to developing countries moving forward to climate-related investments in different sectors like energy and others, there are a lot of challenges that are facing them and nobody is looking at. And again, this comes to the implementation part. Lock-in agreements, high tariffs, all of this stuff are elements of challenges that we want to hear from parties. We'll give the space, we'll allow for the space for these discussions, and we'll see how can we come out with something from that. I'll stop there and let's see what you say.
I think the question for me was on the sources. I mean, today, if you look at most of the reports that are out there, let's take the CPI report that came out on the landscape. If you look at the CPI report, it will tell you that from all the sources of finance and all the climate finance, and the CPI report doesn't make a distinction between developed and developing countries. So it gives you a quantum. Only 6% of all climate finance is grant financing. Everything else is, and pure debt is over 61% of that. But what's more striking is that of that 61%, only 12% of that debt is actually low cost or concessional. The rest of it is all on normal terms. You know, this panacea of the private sector and that, go and look at the figures. The CPI will tell you that most of the climate finance is actually public financing. There's more public financing than private financing. It's very nice to say there's trillions out there and, you know, you're going to get the trillions. Everybody's still waiting for these trillions. It's not just going to, and then the simplicity of it is, well, just fix your enabling environments and the money will flow. You know, I have not seen that. Go and look at the MDB reports as well, right? The expectation on us is we go and leverage the private sector. Go and see what the MDBs are actually leveraging from the private sector. And they have much greater capabilities, much greater spin and all these things, all the enabling environments, the ESGs and everything else that you, and see whether they're attracting the. So when you look at sources of financing, I mean, you would know, and I think it's an UNTAG report that talks about the already debt situation of developing countries, probably something like 191% of the current GDP. And you're saying, well, you need to be more ambitious, and in order to be more ambitious, take more debt. Solve the world's problems, take more debt. And all of the instruments that are being presented today are all debt in a different form. Even if I give you a guarantee, what it's basically saying is I will guarantee that when you go take debt somewhere else, I'll service it if you default. But you still have to take the debt. And everything is being presented as debt. You look at adaptation financing, the CPI report will tell you that only 7% of all climate financing, and they list a figure of 632 billion, only 7% is adaptation financing. It's even more stark when you go and look at the adaptation fund. Right? The adaptation fund, since inception, that's over 12 years, has only had 1.4 billion. Only 1.4 billion. And what's even worse is that of that 1.4 billion, only 14% came from CERs. The rest came from charity. So what does the adaptation fund do? We wait for a COP at the end of the year with a little begging bowl, hoping some country might give you some charity. And even within that, 20% of that 1.4 billion is pledges that haven't been fulfilled. So these are the kind of realities that you deal with. Now we say, well, the adaptation fund, in order for it to be sustainable, will get the proceeds from 6.4. This was the message when the CERs came out. And I remember a colleague of mine in my delegation telling me, oh, you're going to have billions and billions, because that is what the message was. It never materializes. We cannot, I mean, the reality is that if you're dealing with an existential threat today, and to say that you depend on the vagaries of the private sector to save you, then we're living in a very strange world. And these are, what you're dealing with is not, it's not something like, okay, if I don't deal with it, maybe I won't have a Lamborghini, I will have a Trabant. It's not like that. I was struck when I watched some documentary, and you know that in 1999, there was the so-called thing of the Y2K. Maybe many of you are young people, you didn't know about the Y2K. But everybody thought the world is going to come to an end because the computers can't process the 00. The US alone, for the threat of the Y2K, that was in 1999, committed over $100 billion just for that. And look at where we are today in 2020, and we can't even get $100 billion globally from everybody to deal with an existential threat. And that's the reality. So what what we're working with the COP presidencies, and that is when we start talking of innovative instruments, it's not instruments that exacerbates the debt. Those instruments that do not create greater debt for people who are already in debt, and for problems they never created. I mean, that's the sad part of life, and that people that did not create problems are stuck with debt that they cannot pay. And the problem with debt is also, when you're trying to get with the private sector, the more debt I take, the more it gets listed on my debt to GDP ratios, and the more the Standards and Poor's say, guys, these guys have too much debt, they're not really credit worthy. So the private sector are not going to be looking at you in that. So, I mean, these are the kind of challenges that you face. It is a stark reality, and often people don't have an appreciation of that when you come to these processes, because you're an insulated world that you live in here. You don't live in the other world on the other side. And when you live in the other world, you just look at South Africa in the last month or so, where a province received 5 months of rain in one day. People lost their lives, homes, and everything. How do they recover from that? Take more debt to try and recover? I mean, these are the things why loss and damages and all these other things become important. And it's not just a nice to have things. We're dealing with human lives. We're dealing with people, families, and that. I'll stop there, Mina. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think our panel members have to go. There are a few more minutes, but you can talk to us after this. But let us give them a very big hand. I think the voices were so powerful and so strong. We see you as our champions, and we will continue to do the fight. By the way, there is an action on loss and damage, which is going to happen right in front of the Chamber Hall. I think when? Now? 3:30. Yeah, on loss and damage finance, right out there. So we'll thank you again. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
G77 and
It's good. Thank you for being here.
Ali was asking me if I'm coming.